I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, I'd like to remind you that I could really use your support on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. The more support this show gets, the healthier it'll be, and the more you'll be hearing of Parallax Views. So again, patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Any amount will help. $1 a month, $5 a month, whatever works for you. If you can support the show, please do so. With that out of the way, on this edition of the program, we're going to be hearing from returning guest Matthew Petti of Reason Magazine. Matthew, for those that don't know, is a reporter specializing in issues related to national security, international relations, and geopolitics. We're going to be talking in this conversation about a number of different topics, including the confirmation hearing of Elbridge Colby, who has come under fire from both Republicans and Democrats. You'll find out why in the conversation to follow. We'll also discuss Trump's strategy when it comes to Israel and his administration's secretive talks with Hamas, as well as how those talks came to light. In addition to that, we'll also take a look at the detainment of Mahmoud Khalil, who was involved with the pro-Palestinian protests at Columbia University. And in the final portion of the program, we'll discuss what's been going on in Syria. We just saw an uprising and a massacre in Syria, and we'll be looking at what's been transpiring while also delving into the information war shell game that is occurring as we speak. All that and much more in the conversation to follow. So, with that being said, let's get right to it with Matthew Petti. Welcome back to Parallax Views. A favorite on this show, Matthew Petti is an assistant editor at Reason Magazine. He's also written for Responsible Statecraft, New Lines Magazine, The Intercept, The Daily Beast, The Middle East Eye, and The National Interest. I'm probably even missing a few here. How are you doing, Matthew?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. I think I forgot. You also reported for the BBC at one point.
Yeah, that was yeah, I did just a few pieces.
Okay. So I'm trying to cover all the bases here, but you have been very, very busy, not without reason, because there's a lot of national security news, and that's sort of your beat. And I guess the reason I wanted to reach out with you is you wrote this piece just a few days ago, The Bipartisan War on Elbridge Colby. If people don't know who Elbridge Colby is, maybe you could talk a little bit about him and why he's in the news.
Right. Okay. So Elbridge Colby is he's sort of a defense intellectual, think tank circuit guy. He also comes from a long line of national security figures in his family. His grandfather was I don't know if I'm sure many of your listeners have seen the heart attack gun video. where they dragged out the CIA director and were like, "You guys invented a gun to give people heart attacks," and he's like, "Yeah." Um, in the 70s, that was Elbridge Colby's grandfather.
Really?
Um,
Oh,
yeah, William Colby. Yeah, so that was Elbridge Colby. Elbridge Colby's grandfather was the CIA director who was dragged in front of Congress about the heart attack gun. So Elbridge is I think a very much a defense establishment intellectual guy. But he's also a restrainer by the standards of that crowd. He believes that the U.S. this has been something he's been harping on publicly for a very long time, that the U.S. is overcommitted in Europe and the Middle East and needs to focus almost monomaniacally on keeping China out of Taiwan and generally keeping China from dominating Asia. His views, we can talk about this, on Taiwan have evolved a bit. Um, and so under the first Trump administration, he was a mid-level Pentagon official. He wrote the National Defense Strategy, which was a sort of, I mean, is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a sort of whatever 4-year plan or however many year plan for the U.S. military. Uh, Recently, he's been appointed to be the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, so he's going to be leading military planning for the entire U.S. military worldwide, which is a big deal. I mean, yeah, that means that the Trump administration is interested. What he's been talking about, the need to draw down from Europe and the Middle East to focus on Asia, is something that the administration is intent on implementing. And he's also kind of become therefore a target from like both Republican and Democratic hawks who are frustrated with the direction of policy. And his confirmation hearing, I was it last week or the week before, uh, became a big sort of these tensions came out in public.
yeah, and I was gonna say his big enemy, it would seem, is Tom Cotton. Why is that?
Well, because Tom Cotton is very much a Middle East dead ender. Right? His whole career, I mean, if you know how Tom Cotton's career started was like during the Iraq War, he wrote a letter saying that like some New York Times journalist who broke some story about NSA surveillance should be jailed for treason. I'm fighting in Iraq while, you know, this is his kind of thing. And so even though he's pretended to be, I think, or not pretended to be, I think he is a China hawk and a Russia hawk and whatever else kind of hawk, against American protesters hawk, I think his real cause is the Middle East. And so he does not like that Colby wants to draw down. And Colby has taken some positions. Again, I don't think this guy is like some hippie Quincy Institute peace dove. He is an establishment defense guy, but just because of his focus on China and his look at like what the military realities look like he's taken some positions that have really pissed off the Middle East hawks, basically saying
Particularly
that,
with regards to Iran, right?
yes, that's what I was going to get to. He wrote in, I think it was 2015, the Center for New American Security had a debate uh, where Colby said the only thing worse than an Iran armed with a nuclear weapon would be going to war to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. And I think he's expressed this not so loudly lately, but back in the 2010s, early Obama era, when that looked like a serious risk, he was very decisively on the side of don't go to war over this.
Now, there's a clip of him, I think, talking about this that resurfaced from the
Yeah, that was the center. So the Center for New American Security, I think 2012 or 2015. I can look that up in the article right now, or you can just direct people to read the article I wrote.
No, I
Um,
will direct people to read it, but I thought it was interesting that this came back into focus as the confirmation hearings are coming up, and it came back due to what I understand to be a pretty, I mean, openly right-wing pro-Israel Zionist publication called the Jewish Insider, and then since then there's been this sort of whisper campaign against Colby. Can you speak a little bit to that about this whisper campaign and the Jewish Insider piece?
sure. So I think Colby was one of a group of defense picks in the Trump administration that the pro-Israel hawks pretty openly didn't like.
Domino
Um,
was the other one, the other big one at least.
Yeah, Domino and they sort of blamed Dan Caldwell, who wasn't an official pick until he was. Yeah, they also went after Dan Caldwell basically, and I think Domino was the most. outspoken Middle East dove, he has been very critical of the Israeli war effort and very clear about the sort of, you know, the danger that Israel could drag the U.S. into a war in the Middle East. And so when Domino and Colby were picked and sort of Caldwell was unofficially in the running, there started to come out all of these pieces in Fox News and Jewish Insider from like anonymous Republican congressional sources or what have you about how terrible these people are and we don't want them. And, surfacing, I don't think dirt or opposition research, just clips of them, things that they had publicly said. And they were always the most careful about Colby. The Fox News piece, I think one of the anonymous sources sort of let it slip that he wasn't happy with Colby. And I think, um, yeah, I think that he was named, but he wasn't really named in the Jewish Insider pieces until later on, after Domino kind of whatever ended up in the administration without incident, and Caldwell did because their positions don't require congressional confirmation. Colby is the highest ranking one, and so that's sort of where the campaign is focused. And then the people behind, who are going and bad mouthing, and I think it was, the Jewish Insider. The reason they picked it was one because it is a right wing pro-Israel publication, so it'll run these kinds of things. But two, I think they've even though Tom Cotton's not Jewish, he wants to make this into a thing of like, fighting the sort of quote anti-Semitic unquote undertones in the sort of Tucker Carlson isolationists. And
Do you think this is reminiscent of sort of attacks we've seen on people in past administrations that were t seen as too soft on the Middle East or too critical of Israel? So I remember when Chaz Freeman was going to be involved in the Obama administration, he was another one that was like quickly sort of attacked, and I think he ended up resigning from his position or his nomination very quickly. I feel like there's a pattern of this kind of thing.
yeah, except this time it wasn't working. Right? They tried to do it to Domino and Caldwell, who would have been sort of low-level targets, to so to speak. Not to. I've spoken to Dan. I respect him. He's a good thinker, but an important guy. But he's not being nominated to a congressionally confirmed position. It's just he could have been thrown out with a flick of a pen, but the administration didn't want to. They just ignored it. And then now, and then I think it really does speak to how afraid some of these factions are of Trump, that none of them wanted to be publicly named. And I think Cotton actually got dragged out into the sunlight by, I forgot who, I think it was Donald Trump Jr. himself came out and pointed the finger at Cotton and said, "You are the one behind the whisper campaign." And then during the confirmation hearing, even then Cotton was very careful, saying like, Mr. Colby, I want to support President Trump's goals. So I want to make sure that you're on board with what President Trump wants. Unlike the sort of Democratic members of Congress who are just saying, Trump is a traitor or appeaser or whatever, just openly attacking the administration. Cotton was still very careful not to step on those toes.
It's interesting to me because Cotton seems to have like a real beef with anyone who questions uh U.S. foreign policy, sort of blob policy. I know he's going after Quincy pretty hard, calling it a hotbed of pro-Iran lobbying and it's anti-Semitic. And I think he even said it chills for the Chinese communists. He
I
is
don't
like,
think that those people's hearts are in it when they talk about China. I think the Middle East is their passion project. That's like really like something that's just important to their like cultural identity. And I think it's bipartisan, right? For Biden too. We could talk about the bear hug stuff, but I think with Cotton, it really like is a passion project for him that we just need to keep killing Arabs in the name of Israel. And he's not even Jewish. And
well, my point is just he goes really hard on anyone that
yeah.
questions, our foreign policy in the Middle East.
But I think it's interesting now that this is now the official position of the Trump administration, that we need to draw down from the Middle East and Europe. And Europe, too. I mean, the thing is that also a lot of Republican Russia hawks have their heart's not in it. They've just given up. Like it's the Democrats who are holding the line on like, we need to confront the Russian bear. But, the Republicans have almost rolled over, and the thing that they're choosing to fight on now is the Middle East stuff.
I feel like maybe earlier, just a few moments ago, maybe I was focusing too much on Cotton's tendency for subterfuge against anyone that disagrees with U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, because I think what you're emphasizing is that he has sort of shied away from spelling out exactly what he wanted when, talking to Colby in the hearing, and that's indicative of something at least, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Because Cotton was saying, so you will present the president with options to deal with the Iranian nuclear program. And Colby said, yes, I will. And he said, and those options will go beyond just give Israel bombs and they'll deal with it. And what and then I think there was a third thing that I didn't write down in the article, but he said, and you would be open to, for example, giving the Israelis refueling and bombers, right? He wants Colby to commit that he'll send Americans to war with Iran, but he's really shying around spelling that out, that like this is the plan, because the Iran hawks since the Iraq war have had to pretend that what they want is not really a war, it's just diet military strikes, right? It's just sparkling military strikes, right? Like they can't spell out, it's just too reminiscent to say we want to do a regime change war against a Middle Eastern country over WMDs. But on the other hand, they have the momentum because they do have ways of just starting a military conflict that can't be stopped. But the whole gig is up if they actually spell out where it'll lead in the end.
Now, we can move on to other areas outside of the confirmation hearing, but was there anything else at this confirmation hearing that stood out to you?
I think it did stand out to me. So Jackie Rosen was a Democratic senator who both, attacked Colby as an appeaser on Russia, which a lot of Democrats did, but also attacked him as an appeaser on Iran. And I do think it's interesting that Democrats have just taken up the flag of across the board hawkishness. Um, I don't think that that is. I don't think that the Democratic Party, as like every single Democrat, is like this, but I do think this is kind of crystallizing into the Democratic criticism of Trump is that he's not aggressive enough, and that was part of the party platform under Harris. And I don't think that means the Republicans are the peace party, but there is something weird going on from something very. In one hand, we're stuck in the eternal Reagan Bush era, but on the other hand, I think there is something very different from Reagan Bush era politics.
Now, with regards to Colby, I know a lot of people that I don't even think watched the confirmation hearing yelling, "Oh, why would I listen to this Warhawk Colby?" And I think they're referring to his views on China. But it's interesting. I think in that confirmation hearing, he was a bit more
Oh yes, yes,
almost
that is.
softening his view, I feel like.
Yeah, his whole thing for a long while has been that the linchpin of U.S. strategy in East Asia has to be a defense of Taiwan against a Chinese invasion. He seems almost doomered out about that. He's like, yeah, we need to stop China from dominating Asia, but the military balance, the balance of forces around Taiwan is just not favorable. He said Taiwan needs to be spending like 10% of its GDP on defense to catch up. Um, so I don't think he's necessarily softened on his view that like China is the biggest threat to the US, but I think he's just sort of not given up, but I think he's really worried about the whether it's even feasible to stop them in Taiwan and maybe thinking that uh there need to be sort of a fallback plan or a backup plan, which I mean, personally, I don't think China is going to invade Taiwan. I think China is going to want to make it so that the balance of forces are such that no one can stop them if they try, right? And then Taiwan will just make a peaceful deal. But I think Colby thinks that if they go for a war now, um, it's the outcome is not necessarily going to be good for the US. And he's been hinting at this for a while too, because he's been talking about, if we can't defend Taiwan, then we should just blow up the chip factories. Which kind of indicates that he doesn't think that this is going to be the first and last line of defense. He thinks that maybe this is going to be the first of many lines of defense against China.
My impression, though, is that he's not necessarily gung-ho about precipitating a conflict, a direct conflict with
Yeah, yeah,
China.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's what he said. He said we need to not precipitate a conflict because we need time. But I think the reason for that is not that he's less afraid of China. I think the reason is he's very afraid of China and he thinks that this war would go very badly if it happened now.
Now, what did you make of JD Vance's appearance at the hearing to defend Colby?
Oh, I think he was just making it very clear like this is the administration's position. This is not just you know, this is not some rogue official who slipped through the crack. Because I think a lot of what the sort of coverage in Fox News and Jewish Insider was supposed to make it like, oh, this guy just slipped through the cracks. He's like secretly an Obama soft dove. But once President Trump finds out, but I think Vance was making it very clear, like, no, the administration is aligned with Colby's ideas.
What do you think of Vance's recent statements and also the recent statements of Marco Rubio? I saw Rubio recently talking about, I don't know if you saw this, but talking about multipolarity and balance of powers type stuff. Vance seems to be talking about that more.
Yeah,
Are
yeah,
we? Hmm?
I think the administration genuinely believes that. I think they look at the sort of balance of forces around the world and they think that yeah, the US needs like a soft imperial landing. It can't be the world dominate. I think it's exactly what it says in the tin. The
And
problem
this
is that
this
they
doesn't mean
also
that they're this like I know people are going to jump and say, "Oh, are you saying they're doves now?" That's not what we're
no,
saying
no, no,
either.
no. They believe in a that's the thing. They believe in consolidating. Like that I think the trying to like invade Canada or whatever, buy Greenland, Panama, whatever the like
The
the West.
sphere of influence.
Yeah, I think that's two sides of the same coin. I think they look at the balance of forces. They say America cannot have a world-spanning empire, so we need to be like really locking down on what we can preserve. I think that is a classical sort of realist position, right? A sort of Mearsheimer. It's defense. It's not actually Mearsheimer's offensive realism. It's defensive, classic defensive realism, which is going to mean a lot of ruthlessness in areas that are sort of in America's grasp, but also a lot of withdrawal from areas that they think are sort of a lost cause.
Can you pick up on that for a second? I know this, I hope this isn't too far afield, but I see a lot of people saying, oh, the Trump administration's foreign policy is going to be the John Mearsheimer foreign policy. Do you think that is maybe like part true, part not true? I don't.
I think it's part not true because I think Trump has a need. The thing that complicates all of this is Trump also has this like, I mean, I think the defense intellectuals and the foreign policy intellectuals in the Trump circle believe in a sort of very realist thing. I think Donald Trump himself, um, he sort of has a more vulgar idea that America is getting screwed everywhere. And part of that sort of does lend to this realism, but part of it also means like picking these really dumb symbolic fights and trying to just squeeze blood out of a rock and squeeze concessions wherever you can get them. And like the Ukraine stuff, that's one thing to say, okay, we need to wind down the war and, pull back US support and get some kind of security arrangement with Russia to maybe I think people caricature it as like, oh, they're going to flip Russia against China. No, they're not going to do that, but they're going to maybe wind down that conflict so that it's just Russia is less pushed into China's corner and the US is less to worry about in Europe. But then on the other hand, you have Trump being like, oh, Ukraine screwed us. They took all our money and we need to get their minerals and just wasting all of this diplomatic time and energy on this like insane mineral deal that possibly would have committed America further into Ukraine if it had gone through.
With regards to Trump foreign policy and these sort of figures like Colby and Domino, what do you think people should know? Regardless, and I'm not looking at this from like a, oh, are you left wing or right wing, but like what should the people in general know, regardless of their political affiliation?
Yeah, I think I've been surprised at how sort of realist or restrained the Trump administration is. And I think the staffing picks, in the beginning, it was very, very chaotic staffing picks. Because you had like people like Waltz who wanted to reinvade Afghanistan. And then you had people like Tulsi Gabbard who would like, believe that sanctions are genocide. Or I don't know if you use the word genocide, but very much on the opposite side of these debates.
Well, there's some people you
Um,
brought in that are already out, right? Like I think Brian Hook's gone, right?
oh, yeah. Oh yeah, no, that was his first big foreign policy act was just purging the first term Middle East talks where he brought Brian Hook in and then just humiliatingly threw him out. And then he brought in like Morgan Ortagus, who was another Middle East talk from the first term, made her be the assistant to Steve Witkoff, and then like but also hired her in a really like I didn't want to do this. They made me do this. So let's see how like you're on thin ice, Morgan. Uh but yeah, no, I think yeah, in general, another interesting thing is the way in which Stephen Witkoff has kind of taken the reins of diplomacy. Like Rubio, I think, is a kind of old-fashioned hawk Now he's sort of refashioning himself as a realist, but he's not really the chief diplomat, and he's been frustrated with the fact that Steve Witkoff, who's Trump's like personal real estate buddy, is not only on the Middle East file, but also now on the Russia-Ukraine file, just doing things outside the institutions. And I do think there is a cliche of like, there's a sort of cliche like action movie, like, oh, we can't let the bureaucrats get us down. We have to do these things outside the institutions. I think that stuff doesn't always work. But I do think in this case it does because he's just, he's doing very straightforward deal making and sort of bypassing the blob bureaucracy. Problem is that implementing these deals is going to require bureaucratic buy-in. He can't just let them, go on autopilot.
Well, that's a good question. Do you think that's possible? How do you think you get the bureaucratic buy-in?
I think what he's doing now, he's terrorizing the bureau. Well, he's putting realists in the mid-level position, and he's also, everybody's kind of afraid to step on his toes. It's not like the first administration when you had this revolving door and everyone like it does seem like part of his stuff has been wrestling down the administrative state.
This is a good segue into the second piece that I want to talk about you is Trump borrowing Biden's bear hug approach to Israel. Before we get into that in detail, I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on the recent leaking of the Trump administration Hamas talks? Because I thought that was very interesting. That sort of got leaked out and reported on by Barak Ravid, who is sort of the guy from Axios that gets information from the Israeli National Security State. I feel like that was, I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but I think that came out for a reason. I think there's
Yeah, no, no. I think the Israeli national security state and just the Israeli, I think there are divisions and factions in Israel that have different degrees of how mad they are. And I think Ravid himself in Hebrew is like kind of gloating almost that like, Netanyahu bet wrong. But I think Netanyahu and the hawks in the Israeli cabinet are really angry that Trump is actually serious about negotiating with Hamas and getting a
well,
permanent
it's obvious
ceasefire.
they're not happy that he was
Yeah,
talking
and I
with
think
Hamas.
they found out the Axios article said they found out through other channels. So whoever they had bugged in the Qatari side or the Hamas side, someone was, or the American side because they do spy on the U.S. sometimes. Whatever they found got wind of these talks that Trump had kept them out of. Which was their whole nightmare scenario during the Obama administration, that Democrats would keep them out of the loop about like Iran issues. Now, a Republican administration is keeping them out of the loop on an issue that's a lot more existential for, or not as existential, but vital for Israeli security interests. Um, so I think, yeah, they're not happy and they're leaking it because they want to create a media storm that will be like, oh, Trump is an appeaser and weak, and that'll make him angry and turn around. But I think it's might also have the opposite effect and make him more stubborn about getting this done.
So, what do
But
we mean by Biden's bear hug approach to Israel for people that
so
are
yeah,
unfamiliar?
during the Biden administration, there was this notion, and I think it came more from like Biden sympathetic journalists and think tankers and people close to the administration than Biden himself. But it was this idea that like, oh, if you really want to like restrain Israel's actions and get them to, wind down the war, you've got to get them in this really comforting, secure embrace. And then once you got them, like squeeze them tightly, you can kind of whisper to them, like, come on, it's time to calm down, guys. And, that's not really what happened, right? Biden gave Israel everything it needed to continue the war indefinitely, and then like whispered and I publicly made these very softly worded suggestions about how they should conduct themselves in the war, which they ignored. Um, and we can get into like why this was. I think that Biden, even though he may have genuinely believed that like certain things Israel was doing was immoral or they needed to like do the right thing, I think he genuinely militantly believes in the mission, like in the sort of Israeli state ideology that there has to be a powerful Jewish state that's not subject to external pressure. So if Israel was going to do the right thing, it had to come from themselves. There was no squeeze in the bear hug, right? I think it was very straightforwardly Biden was hugging them because he sympathized with their cause and wanted them to be able to finish the job. Um, Now, the irony is that Trump is actually doing a bear hug. He's been showering the Israeli public with praise, making all these promises and threats like that he's going to destroy Hamas, that Hamas is over, that you better release all the hostages now. We're going to crack down on Hamas supporters. We're going to give you all the weapons to finish the job that Biden would give you, right? And then actually behind the scenes, without much of a public fuss, he's basically forced Israel to take the ceasefire deal and stick to it and, you know, participate in this peace process that requires Israeli concessions.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because I mean, on one hand, he's going after Columbia students, but on the other, he's doing things that are upsetting the Israeli national security state.
Yeah, I mean, again, he's like in terms of the what he's doing to upset them, we talked about first of all directly talking to Hamas, which has never been, the US has not done that because they consider Hamas a terrorist organization. Um and he's also not let the ceasefire expire. The Israelis had some kind of assurance from Biden. They said they had a side, they call it a side letter because Biden was constantly giving them these, whatever time they made a diplomatic agreement, Biden would give them some back of the envelope insurance assurance that, oh, you can actually just do what you want. And they're claiming they had an assurance that they could restart the war if the ceasefire wasn't satisfactory. Trump didn't is not letting them do that. He's clearly not letting them do that. Um, and he's pushing them to begin phase two ceasefire negotiations because phase two is a permanent Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and a permanent end to the war. And there were leaks that during these direct talks with Hamas, they were offering these concessions in terms of like numbers of hostages to be traded and durations of this and that that the Israelis weren't even looped in on. Um, but in terms of what he's giving them, I mean, he's every few days he makes some threat that he's gonna just like kill everyone in Gaza. There was the Gaza Riviera plan where he basically said that he's open to relocating the whole population of Gaza, which is a kind of long-standing fantasy of the Israeli nationalists, but also it doesn't seem like he's actually doing anything to implement that, right? So on one hand, they're giddy that this is now on the table of emptying Gaza of the population, but it's almost becoming like a mirror image to how the liberals have the
He's
two-state
very
solution.
not to interrupt you, but he's like very unclear with the Gaza Riviera stuff. I saw a meeting with him and Netanyahu where he's like the Palestinians have had it very badly, and you could tell Netanyahu was like annoyed by this a little bit. And I've also seen him say, "Well, the Palestinians will build a beautiful Riviera for them," implying that he wants them to come back. I
But
don't
he
know what
also
his
said that
game
he
plan
doesn't want
is.
them to come back.
What's that?
But he's also said they're not supposed to come back.
Right, right. Well, yeah, it's like he's speaking like he says
This is fantasy. It's not real. That's the thing. It's just in the realm of fantasy. In the beginning, it would seem kind of worrying that like, oh, there was actually going to be some articulated U.S. policy to like empty Gaza out and muscle the Arab countries into like facilitating this. But it seems like no, he's just talking about how great it would be to make Gaza great. And but the thing is, it's become like how the liberals have the two-state solution as this thing that is this beautiful fantasy that of course is not close and we can't actually do anything for it, but it's just over the horizon. I think that's what the Gaza Riviera is becoming for the Israeli right. They're convinced that like, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. We just listen to what Trump says and then he'll empty Gaza for us out. It's right around the corner. And of course there's gonna be no concrete action towards it. I don't know. Knock on wood. I mean, but
do you think there's anything important to be made of his a lot of people talk about his relationship with Miriam Adelson, but I mean he's also partners with the Saudis. Does that play any role in how things are going to pan
yeah, I
out in
think that
Gaza?
yes, and I think well, Miriam Adelson now is pro ceasefire. I don't think it's because I think she was like flying hostages on her private jet to lobby Trump to keep the ceasefire going. I think she maybe just genuinely cares about the hostages and doesn't want the ceasefire to fall through because that would mean getting a bunch of them killed. Um, but also, yeah, I think the Trump is very close to the Saudis. They have a lot of money in his family businesses. I think he also just likes them. Like he was having a lot of fun during his state visits to Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi line, I think 10 years ago or 5 years ago was that Iran is like Satan, number one threat. They want the US to do whatever it takes to destroy the Islamic Republic or weaken it. And the Palestinians are just these like annoying troublemakers that we can ignore. but I think their attitude has very much changed, ironically, because of some of Trump's decisions of like not shielding Saudi Arabia directly from missile attacks. Um, which even though they didn't really get hit with the brunt of it, there was that incident in 2019 where a lot of their oil production got taken offline by just like a single missile attack. Um, and so they're very scared of instability now. They're very much even before October 7th, they were making amends with Iran because I think they're convinced that Iran has been like kind of cut down to size enough that okay, now we can deal with them and have like a modus vivendi. And also after October 7th, I mean, MBS has been briefing, before October 7th, they were also ready to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia. Since then, MBS has been briefing members of Congress that they are going to kill me. I'm going to get killed over this. And I think it's part of
You're
it is
talking
that,
about the Israeli-Saudi normalization, right?
yeah, 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 saying that if he is too tied to the Israeli government, that his own people will kill him. And I think that's one possibility, but I think there's also a general sort of anxiety that like, yeah, Israel is no longer, I think the Abraham Accords era idea was that, oh, Israel's actually got this Palestinian thing locked down. They know how to control unruly populations. Like they are going to be really good for stability when we get their surveillance tech and this and that. Now I think it's the opposite attitude. Like these people are not good for stability or the status quo. They're like a
Right.
wrecking ball.
And
And because that's also,
it's interesting. I've even seen that with people who I'm fairly certain are, I want to say, mouthpieces or like pro Gulf state types that sort of speak on behalf of the Gulf state as pundits who are saying, well, Gaza should be, the reconstruction should be done by the Gulf states, not Israel. And then you have the far right Israelis saying, well, we should take it, but it seems like there's a real divide in some ways between the
yeah, and
Gulf
I think
states
it's
and
not,
Israel. Mhm.
I think the Gulf states don't have much compassion for Palestinians. I think they do think like, oh,
Yeah, I'm
these
not, I'm
people.
not trying to say that they have like some compassion. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's not like some or Arab nationalist feeling or solidarity or any sort of identification with them. I think they think these people are beggars and annoying, and they've pretty openly said this in the past. But I think now they understand that, like, and I think some part of it is like some switch flipped in Israel after October 7th of like, we can't be pushovers. We need to like we need to sort of make everyone afraid of us and be the wrecking ball. But also that stuff was always bubbling, like these fantasies of refashioning the whole region and total race war and all that stuff, like that was bubbling up in the Israeli right. And I think for a while the Gulf, like during the Abraham Accords era, the Gulf states were able to sort of dismiss that as like, oh, that's just, crazy talk, like, that's not really. But and I think the same way American liberals did of like, oh, those are just extremists in the cabinet. And I think now it's sort of realized like, oh, no, 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 no. They're serious about this stuff. Like they're not being blowhards.
That's kind of the irony of how Israel has been acting as of late, because in a weird way, everything Israel is doing, I think, is actually, I mean, it's obviously the first victims of it are the Palestinians, but I also think that in the long run, this doesn't bode well for Israel.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is this sort of sense that they have that a lot of forces are aligned against them in the long run. And so we might as well, we as in like quoting them, like we, the Israelis, might as well grab as much as we can right now to put ourselves in a favorable position. I mean, I think to some extent, like it worked, in Lebanon. I mean, we'll see what happens because I think that this is not sustainable that they just continue to just mess up Lebanese sovereignty. But for the time being, it's working, right? Like they basically wrecked Lebanon's ability to enforce its sovereignty. They've wrecked Syria's ability to enforce its sovereignty, and right? Now have more freedom of action than they've ever had. I think the long run, you're right. These forces are going to bite them, but I think their mentality now is like we might as well have this freedom of action now, so that when we have to pay the piper, we're in a position to do so. But I think for the Arab states, but that's a clear divergence of interests between the Israelis and the Arab states, because it's from the Arab states do not want this like constant, you know, ring of fire. The Israelis love to talk about Iran's ring of fire. Now the Israelis are the ones with a ring of fire around them, and the Arab states do not want that. They want like status quo stability. And I think the US right now is more aligned with the Arab states than Israel in terms of its interests.
Yeah, and I think the only reason I hone in on that is because I think it's an important point that I think a lot of people assume that the relations Israel has with other countries, whether it's Turkey or Saudi Arabia or even the US, are these things that are set in stone. And I'm increasingly skeptical of that. But I'm saying in the long term, I think things could change very quickly. Um, is there anything else I missed in that article, the Bear Hug article, that you think we should mention here, though?
I can't really think of anything. I do think it's I just want to drive home it's ironic that this is something Biden said he would do and wouldn't and didn't do, and this is something that Trump is actually doing and pulling off. And I think it is, Trump just doesn't have this emotional attachment. I think Biden was a true believer in, or is, he's not past tense, he's not dead yet. But I think Biden is a true believer in this ideology that a lot of American elites bipartisanly have that that it is sort of an American historical responsibility to make sure Israel and the Jewish state is free from outside pressure. I think Trump is not sentimental. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about Palestinians either, but like that's the thing. He likes to make deals. He doesn't really care about these like grand ideological projects, I think. And when he has a project like the Gaza Riviera, it's like it's not even ideological, it's just like this like floating thing, like fantasy. And I think that the extent to which he believes he has to be pro-Israel is just a naked domestic political calculation, which we can talk about the Mahmoud Khalil case then.
Right. So the bottom line is, on one hand, he's going after Columbia students, saying we're going to get rid of Hamas, these terrorist sympathizers of Hamas. And then on the other hand, with regards to, how he's acting with regards to Gaza and what comes next, he's holding secretive talks with Hamas. So there's sort of a double game going on.
Yeah. And I mean, everyone's heard by now about this Columbia student, Mahmoud Khalil, who got snatched up by immigration authorities, and then Trump put out like a poster that said "Shalom Khalil," like you're a Hamas supporter and you're out of here. I think what's been lost in this, in a lot of discourse, I've seen people saying, "Oh, if you're just here on a student visa, you shouldn't be," And for context, Khalil was he was a big figure in the Columbia protest. He was not part of the physical occupation of the buildings that got the police called in, but he was a sort of spokesperson for like an outside not outside, he was part of the Palestine protest organization, but he didn't do things like physically. He was negotiating with the administration on the students' behalf, and he was a media spokesman kind of figure. And I've interviewed him before.
I was going to say, what was your experience interviewing him like?
He's just like he's a very soft-spoken guy, I think, which is something that you wouldn't really get from, and there was this fake video of like people were claiming this is Mahmoud Khalil, some guy like making an actual pro-Hamas speech. And I'm like, first of all, it's not his face, but second of all, like that's not how he talks. He's this very like nerdy kind of, he's a nerd. Like he's just like this nerdy Palestinian guy. Um, and yeah, the other thing is people have been saying, well, he's here on a student visa. That's a privilege. He shouldn't be messing it up with protesting. He's not on a student visa. He's on a green card. He's married to an American. His wife is American. And which is also why this is a bigger deal than just taking someone's student visa away. Like, you know, this is like if I were to marry a Palestinian and we go to America and start to build a life, and then ICE comes and says, oh, but you guys have been saying bad things about Israel, so we're going to break up your marriage. Um, but I think the reason he was targeted, but I also don't think the Trump administration knew he had a green card. They just knew he was foreign and a student at Columbia because when the ICE agents went to his door, his wife was like, "What are you talking about?" They said your student visa has been revoked. His wife said, "What are you talking about? He has a green card." She went, got while he was in handcuffs. She went and got his green card, showed it to the cops. The cops, not the cops, the ICE agents. The ICE agent picked up the phone, called some superiors, said like, "Oh, he has a green card," and then had to come back around and say, "Okay, well, his green card is taken away too," which I don't think is something they can just do by administrative fiat. But it was very clear that someone like upstairs was like, whatever, the big guy says we have to take this guy, like come up with a reason. And then they started playing sort of a shell game because his lawyers filed a habeas corpus petition in court because and the court very quickly was like, yeah, no, you can't deport this guy. But by then they had already moved him out of the court's jurisdiction to Louisiana and
Do we,
not let
so
any.
is he still in Louisiana? Do we, that's what I was going to ask you because I had someone telling me yesterday, oh, it's like they disappeared him. And I'm like, I think he's being held at an ICE center in Louisiana.
Well, they kind of did disappear him at first because they would not let like first they told them this was a very classic, by the way, police state move is they told him, oh, he's being held in New Jersey, and then his wife goes to the detention center in New Jersey, and then they say, oh, he's not here. Where is he? Oh, I don't know. Right? And that's the kind of that is the kind of shell game that regimes play all the time. But of course, this is America, and you can't really get away with that because there's an online detainee locator. So there is a lag, but it did show if you search his name and nationality, it does show up that he's in Louisiana. And this wasn't in my article, but I talked to his lawyer after my article published, and they did get in touch with him, and he is there.
Was this Amy Greer's lawyer, right?
Amy Greer is his lawyer, yeah. Well, I didn't talk directly to her. I talked to her firm.
Okay, okay. What's the response to this been so far? I mean, in terms of civil rights groups and whatnot.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have said that this is, and I think they did overplay their hand by going after a green card holder. I do
I've
think
even heard that there's like some people that you wouldn't expect defending this person.
yeah, no, no, I've seen conservative free speech people come. I mean, what was her name? Ann Coulter. She had a very funny, very funny tweet that was like, "Listen, I want to deport everyone or something, but I think this is a violation of free speech."
Well,
And
I
again, I
think it was
think the
Jeffrey Sachs was saying that even folks at like the Bulwark in the Atlantic are defending this guy.
yeah, and again, I think it's just because of the green card thing. I think they did overplay their hand. If they had just taken some guy's student visa away, there's like legally, come on, that is like the like what can you really do about it? That is kind of the prerogative of the president. But the fact is this guy is a permanent resident, married to an American, like he's an American in waiting, like he's on the way to get citizenship. And I think the administration said so it's not just the usual suspects in terms of like left-wing civil libertarians. It's like, a lot of other free speech people. Even ones who've been biting their tongue. There was some guy who said something like, I despise Khalil, but I stand up for his rights. Like, it's just so blatant. And I think there was also because the administration at first insinuated like we have intel like he is Hamas aligned, he's a threat to national security. And then when they talked to the Free Press, Barry Weiss's publication, some White House officials said, well, the foreign policy of the United States is to fight anti-Semitism. And so therefore it is contrary to our foreign policy interest to have him on campus. It's like, what? Like, that's basically saying that the First Amendment doesn't exist, right? That the U.S. government can do whatever it wants domestically if there's a foreign policy interest.
It sounds like
Um,
the legal grounds for this is very shaky, to say the
yeah, and
least.
I mean the court has the court immediately. Apologies, that was my I'll go get my laundry soon. Um the court pretty immediately like put a stop to this deportation and put a restraining order and said you have to keep him in place. And I don't know, I can't predict. The courts have been pretty deferential to the executive branch on immigration stuff over the past few years, but we'll see what happens. I have a feeling that this is not going to be a simple story. And like I've said a million times, I think they overplayed their hand by going after someone who's not just here on a student visa, who's a permanent American resident.
Right. What do you think this case entails for, civil liberties more broadly in this country?
Well,
Or do
yeah,
you
I mean,
think
get
because of
away
the
with.
overstepping, this may actually be a shot in the foot for, people that want to restrict speech?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just politically, if this fails, then I think it's going to be much harder to get rid of people who are sort of politically undesirable. I think I've also seen, again, I'm not a lawyer or a legal expert, but I've seen actually people talking about like the general like material support for terrorism laws getting a day in court and getting sort of struck down or restrained because the current court precedent in the US is pretty deferential to the government in terms of So it's right, it's illegal to materially support a terrorist organization. And a terrorist organization is anyone the US government says is a terrorist organization. And there's all these politics around who they put on the list and who they take off. There's groups who have been taken off the list despite having killed Americans. There's groups that are on the list that have never killed Americans or haven't even been active since the 90s. Um, and there was a case, Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, about a decade ago, where these sort of peacenik humanitarian people wanted to test what is material support. So they said, we're going to give like peace building classes, like nonviolence classes to the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Because first of all, that's very hard to say that's material support if you're just telling people to be peaceful. And second of all, the Kurdistan Workers' Party is not a group that's like politically radioactive in America at all. Like it's a lot of Americans sympathize with it, including from the right. Um, and then the court actually said, no, that's material support because you're coordinating with a terrorist group. Now, I don't think that Mahmoud Khalil, to be clear, was coordinating with any banned Palestinian group. I think there is no, even under the expanded definition of material support, like he would not be guilty of a crime. And there's a reason why they're not bringing those charges. But there were people talking about, like, the court precedent might actually, because of just how blatantly this is being used to roll back free speech, the whole idea that he's serving the interests of Hamas by having these protests or whatever, um, that like the court case might actually create a precedent that restrains what the government can do with terrorism laws.
What do you think this could entail for actually fighting anti-Semitism in America? Because I feel like this kind of thing could actually do harm to
Oh no,
trying to
yeah, I
fight
think this is it's
anti-Semitism.
awful. It's a very stupid idea to make the political debate about like Jewish safety versus the First Amendment. Um, that's a very bad idea to pit these things together. And I think the thing is that the American left has been very careful not to like, we have all these debates over like, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism, or um is this like trope, or is this, this kind of thing leaning into anti-Semitic territory? But I think the American left has generally like not wanted to be seen as racist or bigoted, and has generally tried to distance itself and separate the issue of Israel versus the issue of Jewish Americans and
Listen,
like
I would go much further than that. I think if you can't tell the difference between these students at Columbia and someone like Candace Owens, I don't know what to tell you, Like that's sort of my argument, but
yeah, but that's the thing. I think the American right, which is now being sort of the anti-Semitic forces in the American right, that were being unleashed. So yes, I think the forces on the American right that are being unleashed now are people who are both um opposed to Israel and also don't care about being seen as anti-Semitic, or just are opposed to Israel because they actually just don't like Jews. You know, like the American left has always had this sort of internal debate and dilemma of like, how do we oppose a Jewish state without opposing Jews? I think in the American right now, you have a increasing faction that's like either Israel is annoying and I don't really care how to stop it, or just like people saying that they don't like Jews, so therefore they don't like the Jewish state. And I do think that I think this is the sort of, for the Nick Fuenteses of the world, um, it's the like golden opportunity for them if the political debate is made into like Jewish safety versus freedom of speech. Which again, I think the right has very explicitly tried to not allow that to be the terms of the debate. And I do think the fact that the overreach is so extreme is going to make it I'm going to make it easier to make that separation, because you'll have like prominent Jewish figures, even pro-Israel figures, come out and say we're against this. On the other hand, the ADL was praising Khalil's deportation, which is, I think, just politically, just leaving the morals aside, was politically an incredibly self-destructive thing to do.
where does Barry Weiss stand on all of this out of curiosity? Do we know?
I don't know. I think the Free Press, the coverage seemed kind of sympathetic, but
Okay, okay.
Again, like Barry Weiss is a right-wing figure, whatever. Like the ADL is supposed to be a liberal human rights organization, right? That represents in the sort of rainbow coalition, like you have the NAACP for Black human rights. The ADL is supposed to be for Jewish human rights. And so the fact that it's like coming out, I think that's like a very stupid and dangerous game that they're playing. But on the other hand, I think the ADL is also kind of making its bed and leaning in this direction for a while now. So
Yeah, and I mean, it's getting bad enough where, I think there's even people on the left and people generally that aren't necessarily opposed to there being a Jewish state, but they're critical of Israel's actions. And even that will get attacked as being anti-Semitic. I mean, it's almost like we don't have any clear definitions of what anti-Semitism means anymore when talking about Israel.
yeah, I know. I think that is very much. I think that is. Yeah, I think that's part of the problem okay. So I'll quote. Are you familiar with the blog Slate Star Codex?
Yes, I am. That's Scott Alexander.
Yeah, so he made an argument a long time ago. So I wouldn't be able to give you the link because I read it like when I was in high school or something. But I thought it really stuck with me where he said every time Nazis use like free speech as a justification for being Nazi, it makes people like Nazism, it maybe like increases Nazism standing a little bit, decreases freedom of speech, right? You're sort of taking this very unpopular, toxic thing and justifying it with this very popular, like consensus thing. And so you undermine both of the consensuses a little bit. And I think uh not to say that this is like perfect analogy, but I think when you use sort of like every American, almost all Americans, before the 2010s, really did not want to be thought of as anti-Semitic, did not want to think of themselves as anti-Semitic, did not want to be anti-Semitic. So if you tell them, you know, this thing is like bad for Jewish people, then they would say, okay, I don't want to do this thing. Or you say this thing is like protecting Jewish people, they'll say, okay, yeah, that's good, right? But when the thing in question is a very controversial foreign policy, I don't think it's consensus that everyone in America hates Israel, but definitely is like a hot potato political topic. You're like, you are you are borrowing some of the aura of, of like inclusion and anti-racism to put on this very ugly thing. You're damaging the aura of anti-racism and anti-Semitism and such. In order, and I think the very unpopular thing, even that, the aura is not really enough to like stop having a political debate over this thing.
Do you have time for just two more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, and this is completely outside of what we were scheduled to talk about, but I wanted to ask you, you do a lot of work on disinformation and conspiracy theories and, just the craziness of conspiracy theories around foreign agents and, all of
You
that
want to talk
stuff.
about the Epstein stuff?
Well, I wanted to talk about that, but I also wanted to ask you a question about how people should be dealing with all the Syria news. And that may be outside of what you expect to talk about, but I feel like you have pro-Turkish elements trying to push narratives and then pro-Israel elements trying to push narratives, and I don't know what is true anymore.
Okay, so more or less, that's the thing. This is a problem for all the like media saturation of Syria. The actual quality of information out of the coast is really bad. So there was the massacre over the weekend. About several hundred people, maybe 1,000, were killed. Um,
Civilians, like at least hundreds of
yeah, yeah,
civilians.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And more or less, what happened is there was some kind of uprising among the Alawi minority. Um, so the Alawi minority is a kind of very small sect of Islam that the Assad family belonged to and was sort of considered a base of support for the regime, the old regime, not the new regime. And there was some kind of uprising by some kind of Alawi militia that where the new regime lost control of some coastal cities, and then they basically, said we're going to stomp this uprising out, sent in all sorts of forces that make up the new government, and then these forces started, massacring just generally like you said against civilians, like sectarian reprisals against killing whole families or just, gunning down villages and such. And we do have, I think, a decent amount of information about that. Like that is clear that severe violations of human rights and abuses against
Well,
people and murder.
even a lot of like people that are very anti-Assad and may have like relatively negative views of the Alawite community. I've seen even them say, "Well, this was an atrocity."
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah,
No, the massacres did happen. And there was an uprising that precipitated. This didn't come out of nowhere. This was in response to there was an armed rebellion. What is unclear is one, was that who was the armed rebellion exactly? Because they keep saying it's Assad remnants, but it's not really clear, like, was this Assad remnants? Was this some local militia that like got that something went out of control? Was this some new Alawi like ethnic mobilization? That's unclear. And the second thing that's unclear, and also this is not my original thought. Aris Rusinos in Unheard magazine pointed this out too. The second thing that's unclear is like how much control the new government of Syria had over the forces that were sent in, because and like who exactly was perpetrating the atrocities, because I've heard that like the Turkish mercenary force, the Syrian National Army, were very heavily involved in this, and I'm not would not be surprised at that. And those people are kind of controlled by Turkish intelligence and not by the new Syrian government, even though they fly the flag of the new Syrian government. And they've just throughout the whole civil war, these people have been like nasty pirates. Um, but then also apparently there were foreign fighters like Chechens and Uyghurs and stuff filmed like speaking in their language while committing atrocities, but also like were the central government's troops just directly doing it? I've seen things to suggest that that was also the case, and how much of this was like all of these, right? It either way it reflects badly on the central government if they can't control their own forces, or they do control their forces and they have them doing atrocities, but it's a very different kind of bad
yeah,
reflection.
and I think to be well, I think even if let's say what is he going by now, Jelani? It's
Sharaa.
al-Sharaa. Yeah, I mean, I think he did come out and say this needs to stop and there needs to be accountability, and it could just be that his forces weren't behind it and it wasn't directed, and this was But even if that's the case, that really reflects badly on him because
Yeah,
I mean he
yeah.
failed the governance test.
No, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Basic governance test is like, is your government going to just start like uncontrollably killing people? And yeah, no, and I think that's why I don't know if you saw, but there was a deal with the Kurdish groups in the Syrian Democratic Forces over Kurdish autonomy, where the details of that have yet to be ironed out, but they did agree in principle to integrate, and they are talking and stuff. And then there was also talks with the Druze militias in the south, and I think that this was less about those groups acquiescing to the new government of Syria and more the new government of Syria needing to do diplomacy and like offer them concessions to just avoid this impression that like, oh, we're just going to start killing minorities, because like the Alawis are kind of alone, and because of their perceived connection to the old regime, they're kind of alone in this. But the other minorities have potential foreign backers, are very well armed, are not in isolated parts of the country, and can really make governance difficult. And I think, right, there are very sensitive. The Syrian government now is very sensitive of the fact that it failed the governance test.
In regards to what I said earlier about you have a lot of narratives floating about, and I do think there's a lot of pro-Israel elements that are really jumping on this massacre story for their own ends. And I mean, there does seem to be a little bit of just consternation between al-Sharaa and Israel. I mean, the defense minister, Israel Katz, in Israel basically said, "Oh, he's a jihadist terrorist." And I think al-Sharaa in Reuters, when he was interviewed in Reuters, said, "Well, the Israelis are the last ones who can talk when it comes to terrorism." So it seems like there's, issues between the new Syrian regime and Israel, and I do think some of the things we're hearing. are kind of coming from pro-Israel voices. Is that important to
Yeah, it's
understand?
a weird
Yeah,
alignment. It is a weird alignment
yeah.
between Israel and Iran here. But I
I'm
think, yeah,
sorry
no,
if I'm sorry if like I'm not wording it well, but it's very confusing to me.
yeah, no, it is a weird alignment. No, but I think it's at the end of the day, like Syria is still Syria. This is a seamless transition of regimes, right? Like the state wasn't really destroyed and over and rebuilt from the top. Like Sharaa just kind of conquered the Syrian state. And so from the Israeli perspective, right? Either way, it's still a state with revanchist claims on or irredentist claims on territory that we claim, also the Golan Heights. I mean, Sharaa's old name was Jolani, like Mr. Golan. His parents were from the Golan. He and were kicked out by Israel. Like, so I think at the end of the day, their mentality is like it doesn't really matter who's in charge of the state. It's just, you've seen a narrative also from like Jolani supporters saying like, oh, the Israelis were happy with Assad and they're worried. No, I think that their attitude has just not changed. Like this is a rival state on our borders. We don't want it to be like unified and capable of threatening us. And I think the Israelis have really, they do think that the minority issue is um, their sort of backdoor into sort of weakening and pulling apart Syria. Um, the thing is that the minorities are not really biting, right? I think the minorities they might not necessarily want to be under a unitary centralized state. They might want some kind of administrative decentralization, but it's a big gamble to bet on the Israelis coming in as the cavalry and saving you. And there have been, I think it's more realistic for the Druze militias, but even they seem to be very cautious about what Israel can offer them.
Yeah, and to be clear, I'm not just trying to pick on Israel here because I think there's sort of an information war shell game going on with.
Yeah, I think it is weird in the information war that the Israelis and the Iranians are both sort of aligned between like Sharaa is a terrorist. But
Right,
for
right.
very
You
different,
have the Iranians
right?
pushing certain narratives. Al-Shara's people push
Yeah.
certain narratives. The Israelis
And you've
push
also
certain
seen the like sort
narratives.
of pro
Yeah.
you've also seen the pro-Russia stuff, right? Of like or like they're killing Christians, which like Christians were not the target of this. This was against Alawis. That does not change. The fact is that like
Yeah, I
you
wanted
need to
to ask you about that. My understanding is that the Alawis are actually Muslim.
yes.
Okay.
Well, their origin is in Islam. They're not Christian for sure. I think it's like debatable whether they are fully Muslim or not. But they're definitely they come from Islam. They do not come from the Christian tradition at all. They're not identified with Christians, and these massacres were not targeting Christians. That again, like that shouldn't matter, right? These are massacres against innocent civilians. But I think the reason why you had this disinformation introduced that it was Christians is because Americans wouldn't empathize. Like they don't know what an Alawi is. They just like they know what a Christian is, and that's us, or like not all Americans, but that's what many Americans consider us.
How does Turkey figure into the information war here?
Oh, Turkey is just like lined up behind the new regime, right? Turkey is a pro-Sharia and supports the new regime, and but I think they're also kind of playing their own separate game with the Kurds. They have a peace process going with the Kurdish Workers' Party, and there was a recent announcement from the head of the Kurdistan Workers' Party who basically just said like the armed struggle is over, we are obsolete, and we're going to disband. And then the party was like, maybe. But I do think that I've heard that there's a lot of behind the scenes sort of symbolic concessions happening, and they are working towards a lot of this is part of like a working towards actually resolving the Kurdish issue. And I think that's part of the reason also why Shara made sure to like not let the Alawi thing stop his negotiations with the Kurdish forces because I think Turkey wants him to do this.
What do you think of how the Gulf states have been covering the massacres? I mean, Al Jazeera seems to have a very interesting line on it where, it's sort of like, oh, they're pro-Assadis, these Alawis.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
Al
yeah,
Jazeera is pro-government. They're
right.
pro-Sharia. They're aligned with Turkey. They're all about, they supported the Syrian revolution and now they support the Syrian regime.
So you have
Uh,
you have these elements on one end, and then you have
and then you
the
have the
Iranian, the
Emiratis.
Israeli elements on the other end. Yeah.
And I think the Emiratis are with the Israelis on this. They don't like the Syrian state being this powerful unified thing that could go and spread revolution to other Arab countries. Like they don't like Sharia and they're going to spread like,
They're afraid
you
of
know,
like a second Arab Spring.
Yeah, exactly. Like they don't want that. They don't want that kind of thing. So they want to portray the new government as dysfunctional and bad.
So what should people get out of this portion of the conversation when it comes to how we look at Syria? My main thing is people should be very careful about the sources they're looking at, and
Yeah, be very careful about unverified claims. I do think part of it is like the media, the news media is not. Look, I mean, it's easy for me to criticize, but I'm like sitting here in London, not in Syria. So, but I do talk to people in Syria, so there's an improvement. I'm not just getting the stuff off of Twitter and X. But yeah, I do think be very careful with like claims that are just videos on contextless videos or people making claims about like you know yeah.
well, hey, we'll leave it at that. Matthew Petti, thank you again for coming on Parallax Views. Plug the Twitter, X, whatever it's called these days, your profile there, and also your work at Reason, how they can read it.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And I'm sorry to end on such a dismal note.
And what's your X profile? And it's Matthew underscore Petty it.
On an X, yeah, it's Matthew underscore Petty, Petti.
Okay, awesome. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. And yes, in case you're wondering, there was an Epstein-related segment within the conversation you just heard with Matthew Petti, and that'll be available on the Patreon page in the next few days. Short segment, but a little something extra as I want to start, releasing very short portions of the show on Patreon exclusively, just as a little something for my Patreon supporters. So please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.